right, let me start by saying thank you all for coming to the talk in Anthropocene, Earthlings Anthropocene Art Talk series. Nice to see you again to many of you who joined our previous talk, and hello to new guests. I'm Louise, a final year PhD student in History of Art at the University of York, and my colleague Francesca, who organized this series with me. Would you like to say hi?
Hi, yeah, I'm Francesca. I'm also a final year PhD student in History of Art at the University of York. Thank you all for coming.
And we would also like to say a great thank you to the University of York Centers for Modern Studies and the Liverpool Center for Anthropocene Biodiversity, who have kindly supported this project. And this series explores contemporary art's interaction with science and technology, concerning the relationship between human and nature, scoping humanity within the significant meteorological incidents now known as the Anthropocene, which has such decisive power to change the enormous history and future of this planet. The term is contested as much as it is used, and in this series we hope to explore the colonial, political, historical, technological, and social complexities involved in contemporary art's navigation of this terrain from multiple institutional and geographical perspectives. So in the talk today, we are greatly honored to have Janet Laurence and Chang Wan-chen join the conversation. Janet is an artist from Australia, and her work shows immersive engagement with natural ecologies through diverse materials such as plants, video, pigments, museum archives, and natural historical specimens. She was awarded the Australian Antarctic Arts Fellowship in 2020 and was a visiting fellow of the College of Fine Arts at New South Wales University. And we are delighted to invite Wan-chen to join the talk. She is the curator of Janet's solo exhibition Entangled Garden for Plant Memory in 2020. It's a very beautiful show representing natural history in Taiwan. I'm sure it will be a fascinating talk with the artist's view and its curatorial aspect that Wan-chen can share with her museological perspectives. Wan-chen is a professor of the Graduate Institute of Museum Studies at the Taipei National University of the Fine Arts. And she has currently gained a new role at the National Museum of Natural History in France as an associate researcher at local heritage, environment, and globalization multidisciplinary research units. We're beginning from Janet's introduction of her works and following with Wan-chen's talk about this show. And also Janet's going to share some pictures of this show. And I hope we could have about 15 minutes for interactive conversation and answering questions from audience. During the speaker's presentations, may I kindly ask you to turn off your microphone and camera. You can turn your camera back on for the Q&A section. And if you have any questions, welcome to bring them to the Q&A by either using the raising hand button or typing in the chat box to let us know. This talk is being recorded, so if you have any problems with this, please feel free to leave at any time. We have also turned on live transcription if you wish to get rid of this on your screen. There's an option to hide it if you click the arrow by live transcript. We're happy to see you all, and I hope you'll enjoy this hour with us. And now I'll pass over to Janet. And Janet, please start when you're ready.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for having me here. It's a really great pleasure for me. What I wanted to talk about very briefly is an introduction to my work before we talk about the show in Taiwan. And basically just to bring the whole theme of my work is to bring attention to our nature, the wonder of it, and the fragility of it, and our necessary interconnection with it. I use vast range of materials in different, indoor, outdoor, This is like a poetry walk, but basically there's just different sort of themes to work with to bring attention to this. A lot of my work is very research based, so I go to sites that have been damaged, just, you know, through climate change or man's destruction. In this case, it's a bushfire, where I go and then I sort of set up a type of cellular garden that's like a healing garden for this bushfire burnt place. But in actual fact, it's more or less to develop new works from that, which this is an example of, like a little cellular gardens work. This is from Chiapas in Mexico, where they're destroying the forest there, which destroys the economic, social, and environmental life for the indigenous people and has led to the most catastrophic situation. I was there at the beginning of this massive deforestation project. And then the whole idea of the gardens is, can we try and regenerate? Can we try and offer hope? And I do this a lot in my work, is this play between the despair and the hope. In another site of deforestation is in Tasmania, where we have these great old giant trees. Like you saw in the first slide, I felt it's very, very important to show these trees that are still connected with Gondwana. You know, they're replaced by trees for forestry industry. It's a very tragic situation. Oh, sorry, something's going wrong here. So here I take a lot of laboratory glass into the forest, and this becomes the forensic lens through which I photograph and create images of this setup. It's also the idea of the scientific glass, the idea of some sort of healing process that may begin in this desecrated landscape, which was once amazing old growth forest. And it leads to all sorts of works that might be wall works like this, where I actually reveal the actual type of trees that are there, and the lab glass you can see, and there's a whole range of these sort of works that tell this story for these trees. And then another way I try and talk about probably more the wonder of nature is making these garden works. This is actually in Berlin, the IGA of Berlin in 2017, where I created a garden for psychotropic plants. Inside was like a little museum all about these plants, their mythological and scientific stories and medical stories that have been recorded for so long, these plants. And so it's quite educative, but it's not didactic. It's very poetically played out. And it's a beautiful little space to be inside the life of these plants. And one thing I do make a lot of is hospitals. Hospitals to bring about, obviously, the need and the attention to caring, and a language of healing and care, and this, what I call in this aesthetics of healing and aesthetics of care, and actually empathy, where you can see little fragile dying plants in a hospital, and all the wards are just like what we have in a hospital, like intensive care, the maternity ward, there's a morgue, and all these things, so that people can begin to associate. Because how do you bring empathy for plants and some animals? I mean, how do we bring this care for them in order that we will care for them in the world? So this is this real attempt to do this, and the people guarding the work, they wear white coats and they feed the little plants with little droppers and intensive care units, you know, intensive care elements. So people can very much associate with it. And then the works that died from that particular little hospital and now belong in a museum. So they've become a memento mori of all of those plants that have been sculpted into various forms that sit within this museum, art museum space, which is surrounded by colonial paintings that are showing the beginnings of the destruction of the environment in this country, Australia, so recently settled by Europeans who started to farm it in this very destructive way. And so the little owl is looking out, his tree is dead, the grass is green in this particular painting that he's looking at. And it's the beginning of the ring barking industry, which was the most destructive practice in Australia, where it started to fence Indigenous people off from their land, because they ring barking the trees to make fences. And basically it was the beginning of this destruction of our environment that we're now really busy trying to heal now. And then another memento mori that's a huge accumulation. This piece is quite recent. It's called Requiem. It just gathers together all these fragments, images, specimens, plants and sculptured objects and texts, naming species, etc. They're gathered together in quite a deep installation that is really a lament for so much that is lost in our landscape, in our nature. And then another hospital, which I've done in a few different places, is the Hospital for the Great Barrier Reef. And as we know, the Great Barrier Reef is like the canary in the coal mine. And the specimens, are many of which are borrowed from the Australian Museum in this case. And they are all tubed up together, but there are a lot of other elements within it that I have made. And there's a video that sort of goes through the work as well, so that it lights and moves and creates energy within the work. And this one I did in Paris for the Paris climate talks. And so you can see the most amazing specimens that I was able to borrow from the museum in Paris, in the Jardin des Plantes, where Wan-chen's working now. It's a beautiful circle how we all connected through this museum, in fact. And you can see like a detail of a video. The videos are being made up in the Barrier Reef. I work with a filmmaker up there on these works. And basically when they go through the work, it sort of starts to shift the colors and they feel quite alive and quite fluid. Other works to bring attention to this fragility are what I call little natural history museums for today. They're quite theatrical. They're a lot of research I've done in different sanctuaries around the world, and make these films that reveal these animals literally on life support in these sanctuaries being kept alive, and also a lot of other intersection of objects and medical equipment, etc., and veils and screens, so you look through things into them, and revealing and borrowing a lot of things from the museum, specimens that they never show. Shocking to some people, these like pouch young of koalas and kangaroos, that so many of these animals that have been killed in this terrible plunder of the land here. And so just to reveal all of these sort of things that are hidden away in museums. Another little one is shows a lot of images from Aceh, where I did a residency with fauna and flora after the tsunami, and to watch all the incredible, on the one hand, the caring and the repairing processes, and being able to use the camera trap images of the scientists and working with the scientists and understanding this incredible type of regeneration of land that's been so destroyed, in that case through the tsunami and warfare. And the other image is a mine that's filled with skeletons. So it's always these horrendous things, but at the same time, this attempt for healing. And trees on life support has been something else I've worked with in different countries. You use different trees according to the species that you know, are endemic to that place. And in this case, it's in Australia, it's a big eucalypt with hanging tubes that are all pink. And is it transfusing the fluid up, or is it spilling it all down? So it's like this thing of, it's between, is it dying or is it trying to be revived? And in Belgrade, and the most amazing, huge, enormous Dutch elm, laid out a bit like a corpse, trying, as you can see, to be resuscitated in this huge old building. the Dutch elm disease, as you know, has killed so many trees in Europe, and so it had been dead a long time. And here I have little herbs administering medicinal herbs to it, and the attendant in his white coat walks around and attends to it all. And interestingly enough, there was a huge ant life inside. The ants just had so much fun with all the herbs and the tubes, and it's kind of quite an interesting thing. You've got this very dead tree, but within it is all this life going on. And luckily it was a big old bombed out building, so we were allowed to have all that happening. And then with trees, it's been such a huge thing for me. Recently at the MCA, I was able to do this huge piece, The Theatre of Trees, with these big hanging 7-metre transparent veils that form concentric circles that you walk in amongst with film projections. Each veil carries a different tree. There are about 70 trees that take you through into the centre of the work. And you can just get an idea here of the experience. And lots of the trees are telling their stories about trees, even their mythological stories, and some of them are just images of trees that I've gathered. And at the edges of this forest is like a little tree library. It's like being inside a tree. It's very wooden. It's got a floor of the rings of a tree that's spinning round, as a matter of fact. And inside is just all books about trees, videos about trees, and stories from long ancient stories, scientific stories, and recent videos of tree felling, and a lot of mythological images of trees, such as, you know, all the stories about people who turn into trees, etc. So it's very rich in its talking about trees. And in the other corner is an elixir lab, where you actually have an attendant who offers you test tubes with the juice of plants within it to taste that being of that plant. So they're not made into drinks. They're quite bitter, in fact, and quite nasty tasting, in fact. And around are the images of the tree, of the plants in which you're drinking. And borrowing specimens, talking about that from museums. Here is a work from a time ago of a borrowing of birds. And the fact that there are so many, that's really what it's about, that you go in there and there's over 200 little birds lying there, sort of lying on their backs, sleeping, dead, whatever. But the fact is that 2/3 of them have lost their habitat. So it's you get quite an impression, and it's very different to the way a museum would display their birds. And finally, this recent installation I was able to do in the most extraordinary museum of the most amazing collection that's been so celebrated, this huge, enormous colonial plunder of the most beautiful, beautiful birds and other animals that I was able to use to make this work, which is truly a lament for the loss of them. And it's set in the ballroom of this museum. So it was quite a terrible beauty to come across, in fact. And you can sort of see some of the details of the work that just reveal this quite amazing, shocking situation, which is actually a most beautiful museum. So it's a rich museum, and it's very celebrated natural historians collection. And finally, I have just a slide from a film that you might have received recently from the bushfires in Australia, and sometimes use some of these images as stills. I work with the negative in them, and it's still something I'm very haunted by, is the horrendous bushfires that killed so many species, so many plants, so many animals. We're still trying to come to terms with this. So I think that's really what I'm just going to show for this this part of the exhibition. Oh, sorry, exhibition, for this part of the talk.
Thank you, Janet. It's fascinating. And now Wan-chen is going to talk about this project from her curatorial perspective. Please take over when you're ready.
Okay. First of all, many thanks, a great thanks to Luis and Francesca for inviting me for the talk today. And also it's a great pleasure to meet you, to be with you all in this virtual forum. To talk about my exhibition that I have curated with Janet last year in Taiwan. I will talk about very quickly my role in this exhibition and how I conceive the exhibition, and then I will talk about the process of collaboration with different partners, and then maybe I will add some final remarks on art exhibition, on the difference between art exhibition and scientific exhibition. So the exhibition project began with an invitation from Yusho Art Museum, whose curator wished me to curate an exhibition on whatever I want. And I thought of Janet immediately, whose works always interest me so much. And I contacted her, and I got a very proactive response from Janet. And that's how the collaboration started. And to conceive the exhibition, for me, there are two important points. The first is the very nature of Janet's art. For me, her art is often closely linked with museum collections. She has worked with different types of museums, be it artistic or scientific. And some of them are very important institutions of the world. She discusses how museums establish, classify, and display the collections. And in this sense, her art for me is very museological. The second point is the venue and its spirit of place. The Yusho Art Museum is situated at the very center of Taiwan Island and is designed as to integrate into its environment. I felt if Janet came there to produce an exhibition, it should be related to Taiwan's land and history, and it should not be an implantation of an already made exhibition. So I have the idea to talk to the University Museums of National Taiwan University, which is the most famous and the most ancient university in Taiwan. I have been acquainted with some professors of life science department of the university museums who are in charge of the natural history section. We have always thought of producing an exhibition together for a long time, so it is a good chance for us, and they accepted my proposal without any hesitation. I think it is very important to establish the good collaboration that you have to have a mutual confidence between the partners. And so I will continue to talk about the process of collaboration. And I think it would be helpful to show you some photos of the exhibition. So Francesca, would you please? So here is a photo of Yusho Art Museum. And you can see that it is not a big one, and it's very integrated into its environment. Janet and I, we conceive the whole museum as an organism, just like a tree in a literal sense. And we define the ground floor. The museum has the exhibition space has 3 floors. So we define the ground floor as a root level, the middle floor a foliage level, and the upper floor a habitat level, which was actually a memorial for the animals. Next one. The root floor exhibited only one work entitled Harshak, Blood and Chlorophyll, which was a reinterpretation of Jenny's previous work. For this work, first of all, I had to find a big tree. For the tree, I and the museum staff have visited, first of all, Forest Bureau of Council of Agriculture, in Chinese, 林务局, but they did not want to assist us. And finally, I found this big tree already dead in a forest land of my friend. I was happy with the result that we did not have to cut a tree in order to exhibit it. I think it is also a matter of ethics. Next one. And for this work, we needed also rocks, owls, and fungi. The rocks was from university museums. They are collected mainly by the professor of geology department during their field works. The rocks are generally not very big, so they can easily to carry and to demonstrate in teaching. But for the exhibition, for the show, the rocks collection are too small, so I had to select the biggest ones. And also, in order to appeal the eyes, we have chosen the visually beautiful ones, which are not necessarily the most scientifically important. So I had to negotiate with the professor of geology department for their help to show the scientifically important ones, of course. Next slide, yes. And for the owl specimens and the fungi, there were loans from another institute, Endemic Species Research Institute, which is located not far from the museum. For the selection of specimens, we had to rely on the selection of experts there, because we are not so familiar with all the wild animals. Our hope was the specimens exhibited could be diversified as well as representative of Taiwan species. And besides, the exhibition venue's climate was not always suitable for the living species. So the researchers of the Endemic Species Research Institute selected the proper ones for us, especially for the fungi, who can resist to the climate of the indoor exhibition space. Next slide. For the foliage flower, it is consisted of 3 works. In the center, the work entitled The Force That Through the Green Fuse Drives the Flower is from a poem. This work is composed of more than 40 endemic plants. These plants were selected and cultivated by the herbarium of National Taiwan University during the 6 months before the exhibition, concretizing the botanical knowledge of the university. Next slide. This photo shows the plants were cultivated in the historical greenhouse of the herbarium. For the exhibition, even the containers are borrowed, containers of the plants are borrowed from the laboratories of the university. Next one. Another work entitled Conversations with Plants. The images revealed the mountains and landscapes that Janet has visited. In addition to Australia and Bhutan, Janet also included images taken in Taiwan. Next slide. And the final work of the foliage floor was the work entitled Inside the Flower. The work is a cabinet of curiosity, an artist's version of herbarium. For the work, besides artist's personal collection of goods, we also borrowed from the university the old books on botany, and most importantly, about 20 images of herbarium specimens. Next slides. The same for the specimens of plants. We had to rely on the selection and the suggestion of the professors of herbarium, for there were so many, and we are unable to choose. We are unable to select the important ones. Many of the specimens were collected by Japanese professors during colonial periods. Each specimen has its own story. They witnessed Taiwan's colonial history, in which the Japanese discovered the island through studying the species, and at the same time contributed to the establishment of natural science in Taiwan. Next slide. And finally, the upper flower. The thing of upper flower is habitat. As I said, it was a memorial of animals and consisted of 3 works. I will particularly talk about the one with birds specimens from university, the bird song. As you have seen in Janet's talk, this work was also a reinterpretation of Janet's previous work, but with a smaller scale. However, with different sorts of objects, the meaning of work changed. Next slide. The bird specimens of NTU collections has been established since the colonial period. Many of the exhibits came from the Aoki collection. Professor Aoki was in charge of zoology seminar since 1929 and has laid the foundation of zoological study in Taiwan. These birds are very fragile, so we have decided to change the exhibits in the middle of exhibition period in order not to expose them too long. Next slide, please. So you could see that throughout the whole process of collaboration, the university museums not only borrows us their collections, but in fact participated at the selection of exhibits, so as to have an effect on morphology of the exhibition. As curator, I accepted and try to optimize the situation. I thought it was my job to create an all-win result for all the partners. Janet could use the most precious natural history collections of National Taiwan University, and the university and Endemic Species Research Center could show their tangible collection and intangible knowledge in an art museum setting, and everyone was happy with this. Also, I was always sure that this was an art exhibition and not scientific exhibition, but we treated specimens with scientific rigor. The way we labeled the specimens was strictly scientific, but the specimens were displayed according to Janet's creative idea. For me, the very difference between a scientific exhibition and art exhibition is perhaps the former tries to answer a scientific question, but the latter tries to offer a way of thinking, be it scientific or not. The final remarks is to use the university collections is a way to invoke Taiwan's history, so that the exhibition will be infused with the temporal dimension besides its environmental one. The exhibition had no intention to cherish the memory or to criticize Taiwan's colonial past, but we showed how the human beings tries to know his environment through discovery, collection, and research. The specimens were the silent witness and invited us to reveal the lesson behind. And thank you for your listening. I will end this.
Thank you, Wan-chen. And I think Janet has more photos of this show. Would you like to share your screen now?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to also thank Wan-chen for the wonderful opportunity I had to exhibit. It was the most extraordinary opportunity for me to go to Taiwan, and she had organized for me every day to meet scientists or professors and to introduce me to the natural history of Taiwan. This first day for me was quite staggering. We went to this most beautiful forest full of biodiversity, which really fascinated me that it actually had been planted during colonial times. So this kind of set a whole story for me about Taiwan and learning about this period and what flowered from it was quite interesting, was fascinating. Anyway, the nature of Taiwan is staggeringly beautiful, and the place where the museum was a most beautiful experience to live there in amongst the landscape of 99 peaks. And so I can't thank Wan-chen enough for this beautiful opportunity and to be guided by your knowledge. So here you've seen the route, the exhibition that you walk into, this beautiful preserved cherry tree and the rocks that sit on a mirror and create and take you downward, and where the fungi and the owls look out at you, and these beautiful owls, and then they get reflected down and you can see the fungi there too that is specially grown for the exhibition. The number of people that worked on this, that made this happen, is just phenomenal. Thank you for organizing all of that. I hadn't realized how complex it would be. And you can see here these beautiful owls reflected down into this mirror. So there's this whole underworld down there as well. And upstairs into the foliage space, the vitrine work starts at this very green end, and then you can see as she mentions, this beautiful garden we were able to have based on this herbarium. The university, this beautiful herbarium that I carried the memory of it with me and wanted to kind of have something like that in the museum. It was absolutely beautiful space. And so also there's a projection of a film, again, that sort of projects the color a little bit through the plants and varies it a little bit so that it's quite active, the space. And you can see the details inside the vitrine of every day I went out and I collected leaves and things which I'd form into sculpture, paint them or whatever, and put them together to try and form this kind of, it's like a garden in a funny way, and how things interconnect with one another. I just let the plants speak all the time. I just let them tell me what to do. And then you can see the other aspect of this vitrine, a very beautiful layered vitrine, is some of these beautiful fungi that had been made on these sticks, and combining them with some of the images that I've had collected that worked, you know, tell a story with them. And there's, just to look at that herbarium in the university was in itself the most beautiful artwork. I feel I wanted to have this feeling in the show. And then you can see there were also books that were lent to us. And so it's about juxtaposing these borrowed books and herbarium specimens, and then putting matter with it and making these stories occur. And this end of the vitrine is, I always call it the white end, where I gather the plants into this mesh and record their dreams into vials. And then we saw the birds, the beautiful birds, and their labels they're laying out, and that sat on a most beautiful structure on top of a mirror. So it was a very beautiful sculptural piece. And I had hanging veils in this too that were specially made for this exhibition that have projections going over them. So it's, you know, again, very different to the veils that had been in the other theatre of trees. And these are really, they're changing all the time. I think it's called, the work's called In the Breath of the Forest. And you can see that you can move in amongst these things. It was a very beautiful feeling to be amongst them. And then this is the video that's in a little room on its own, where there's a huge mirror, a mirror so that you're there in this video of the animals breathing. And this is from an earlier work called Vanishing, where it's the abdomens of the large mammals that are in a zoo, which of course is like a life support system, that are there breathing, and you within the mirror breathing with them. So I'd like to finish with that, and thank you for having me here very much.
Thank you very much for Wan-chen and Janet for the wonderful presentations. And now we'll move on to an open conversation focusing on today's topic, humanity within natural history. I think you might have some ideas to say or ask each other. And if there's any question from the audience, you may type them in the chat box or raise your hand virtually. I will need Francesca's help with this to read them. And Janet and Wan-chen, if you have any idea or questions, please feel free to speak anytime. When we are waiting for questions from the audience, might I just take advantage to ask the first questions? In our previous talks, the previous weeks, our invited artist, Jakob, also developed his project with very similar methods, like some investigations of natural objects to present the natural, not only its diversity, but also in the concept of totality. I think in your projects, they're more about the relationship built through presenting this totality. I'm curious about the term entangled, and could you talk more about the idea in terms of entangled garden? And by talking more about it, perhaps Janet can tell how an audience of your show was expected to engage in this relationship with nature you try to reveal. And to Wan-chen, could you talk more about how to make all sub-things, like different layers, work together to communicate with this experience of nature, please?
Do you want me to go? Yeah. Well, I guess for me, the idea of entanglement, I know it's a word that's being used quite a lot now, but for me, it is about the it's basically about the interconnection of everything. And I work often from the being of the element I'm using. So I try to make my choices for what it responds, how it responds to something, as if that is a being that I'm not guiding, but it's guiding itself. It's like, you know, you're working from the ground up and you're finding the interconnections. And I kind of like this way of slipping into that specimen itself. And so it finds its relationships. And often I think it's really interesting because I have a garden which I watch how it grows and what things interconnect with one another. And it's such an enormous lesson to see that. And I like to do that, to get rid of myself and just enter into the being of nature in a way. And so that idea of entanglement is what weaves into one another through its selection.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yes. About the 3 layers, I think it's the idea came to us quite naturally when we images the museum, the whole museum, as kind of tree, as I said, literally a tree, because I have always the idea, since we are treating an exhibition about nature environment, so I conceived the museum itself as part of the nature. So for us, when we talked about the idea to imagine the whole museum as a tree, it's very natural that the 3 level could be defined as a root, a forage, and also a habitat where the animals lived in the nature. And of course, the term garden is not just a garden, it's a kind of symbol of the nature, symbol of the environment, and even symbol of the earth, the globe where we live. So, but the garden is more beautiful to name it. And so that's how the title of the exhibition is conceived. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think there's an audience has a question for you, Hanling.
Hello, Janet, and hello, Wan-chen, teacher Wan-chen. Thank you very much for both of your wonderful presentation. And I did visit the exhibitions back in Taiwan. And I have 2 questions. First one will be mainly for Janet. So the first question is how we should see the exhibitions and to get the ideas from the artist, especially for this kind of very heavy scientific item based. The question the reason I ask is because when I listen to Janet's presentations, I also get the concept that during or in the exhibitions, we also can have the feeling of healing. But how we can get this feeling in surrounding by the dead animals or like quite negative natural reactions. And I have another question is more for the process. I'm interested in that after the exhibitions, how those items be dealt with, because like for example the plants or fungi, they are alive, are they going to the museum collections, or how do you deal with those items that is alive? This is my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And is your second question for Wan-chen or for Janet?
Maybe for both. Because Janet have a lot has a lot of these kinds of items, so I'm not sure if will you bring it back with you, or how you allocate them after the exhibitions.
You mean specifically from this exhibition? But usually I do have plants left over. Sometimes I plant them in my garden. I don't like to destroy things. I'm not sure exactly. I think it was up to Wan-chen how all these specimens, they all had to go back in enormously complex way that everything was packaged and brought to us up into the mountains. And they all had to be taken back to the university. And I imagine then they have to be fumigated to go back into their museum collections. That's what normally happens. Because the thing about the museum is, as you know, it was a very, it opened up to the outside. So it wasn't like a normal sterile atmosphere of a museum. So I think that most of the things that I borrow, everything I borrow goes back to its collection, and many of the things I own myself, they come back to my studio. Very little is thrown out, very little. And the other question was, was I've got to go back to it. How do we express? Yeah, I know you present the loss and the death and this very sad thing, and then how to present the other side of hope and the possibility of caring and healing. I think I find it's hard, and I question myself too how to do this. But what I do think is that I'm interested to bring empathy to, like, for example, for Great Barrier Reef, like little tiny specimens and things people don't normally see. How can we bring empathy to these creatures that are being lost for climate change? Is I do them like on intensive care as if they're having an infusion, like a transfusion, a blood transfusion, because people relate to that. That's why I like the hospital is my way to make people understand that all of these plants and animals also have needs to be cared for. And then that's why I like to think about that it can address a healing for the larger environment. But, you know, it's hard. It's not always so successful, I don't think. I mean, it's not about that. It's just sometimes they remain as quite sad and like a memento mori, you know.
Well, my main questions is, so when we go into these kind of exhibitions, what kind of, for example, emotions that we can like help ourselves to get the ideas from the artists about the various concepts that the artist wants to deliver to the public?
I also think that the works are not at all didactic. And so I think it's often, you hope, usually I try to make a space that makes you slow into it. So you engage inside it. So you have time to engage. So they're not fast things. They're not like fast images. You take a while. Even the ones on the wall, they're quite layered and you can't see them exactly straight away. So I think that's a way of slowing you into it so you can begin to enter it. And yeah, and then people can feel what they want. I mean, you know, it's up, I can't dictate that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We've got some questions coming in on the chat.
I can I just compliment a little bit. Yes, for the after the exhibition, the collections go back to where they come. Very simple, except the big tree. The big tree is already dead when we found it. So after the exhibition, the museum has cut the exhibition in pieces and put them back into the forest behind the museum. Back to nature. Back to nature, yes. And also I would like to add some my thought about this exhibition is this exhibition is not just for a moral lesson, or not for me is the didactic aspect is not the most, it's important, but it's not the most important. The most important for me is the aesthetic value of the Janet's work. For it is an art exhibition. So I think, I hope the visitors, the audience, could first of all have a kind of aesthetic enjoyment. And I think that if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, Janet could correct me, but I think Janet's art is very beautiful. It is intentionally to be beautiful. Not all the contemporary artists want their art to be beautiful, but Janet's art is very beautiful. And I think extreme beauty, especially extreme beauty, can make us reflect, rethink more about the nature, the nature inside it. And so I think that's how we can feel this kind of caring, healing when we look at Janet's art. And so I think it's very important to mention it. If I am wrong, Janet can correct me, but I'm always convinced of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Francesca?
Yeah, perhaps we only got time for maybe one question. The first one that came up was asking about the responses of various university scientists to the exhibition. I wonder if you could say anything about that.
The scientist?
Yeah, so she's we've got a question that's asked. I'm curious to know about the responses of the various university scientists.
To see the exhibition? Yeah, the scientists or the professor of life science department all came for the opening of the show, and they were really happy with the result they saw. And they are quite amazed that their collections are represented in such a way. They never thought of it. For example, for the rocks, they can never thought of the rocks could be displayed with a dead tree, with a mirror, in the way the show presented. And also for the birds, and it's not always in the in the science museum, the birds specimens are generally displayed in a kind of showcase and with a label, but never in a circular way like the show. So they are quite amazed. And they are very happy with it. They know that it is an art exhibition, so they are quite satisfied with it, and they are even proud of being able to participate in an art project. For them, it's a very unique experience. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we got it's almost the end of our, but perhaps one more question from the audience.
Yeah, quickly. The next one that came up is from Sam, who said, thanks for both presenting, really interesting work. Janet, if I heard you correctly, you briefly mentioned showing the dreams of objects in the vitrine. Could you say more about this? There seems to be a rich dynamic between the traditionally contained ontologies of natural objects in a vitrine and the way you're suggesting the objects somehow can expand beyond the bounds of the museum display, which is interesting.
Yeah, well, it's something I've been working with a bit. There's no scientific material to go with this, but there's some mythological stories about it, and I love to. It's just basically articulating and imagining which I think art has the license to do, but in actual fact, who's to say that the plants don't dream? Because we know for a fact they sleep, and we know that they have visitors during the night, and we know they have this whole life. And I actually love the idea of starting to imagine this dream life as well. But it's definitely not based on science at this stage, but old myths.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Well, we are at the end of this hour now, and it's definitely the wonderful hour. And let's say a big thanks again to Janet and Wan-chen for this fascinating talk. And I hope every one of you enjoyed this hour, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. Perhaps we'll see some of you in our next week by Rare Rizaldi and Anna Bilbao next Friday. I'm sure it will be another wonderful hour. Let's say thank you again to Janet and Wan-chen, and I hope we'll meet again soon. Bye.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for having us, Francesca and Louise, and for all your work in guiding us.
And it's very, very beautiful, beautiful exhibition.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if there's any other questions after, I will be happy to answer by mail or by
Brilliant.
online. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's so lovely to see you, Wan-chen, again.